Everybody, thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to introduce my friend Chris Eddy. Chris has a background in philosophy and education, and for the last decade, his work has focused on civilizational collapse and existential risk. He has worked with the Civilization Research Institute since its inception, including work on the Consilience Project. He has also been a collaborator of the Center for Humane Technology. And I'll add that Chris is here today in a personal capacity, speaking for himself rather than any organization. So just as an overview of sort of the schedule here, I'll ask Chris some initial questions about altruism and the meta crisis, and then we'll open it up for group questions and discussions. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about integral altruism and the meta crisis and all those things.
Oh, also, for some reason, I think the recording didn't start. So let me.
I think it's going.
Okay. Was it showing that when I was speaking? Because there was a pop-up or something that said
transcribing. So that makes me think that there's some kind of AI transcribing tool that's on top of the recording.
Okay, cool. So hopefully we didn't get that initial clip, but in any case, it's okay. Cool. So yeah, I think a good place to start, Chris, would be if you don't mind sharing just a bit about your background. So in particular, maybe asking, what pulled you to try to make things go better in the first place, sort of altruism, and what did that mean to you at the time? And then how did you come to work on the meta crisis specifically, rather than working on like a particular cause area?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think my screen just popped up a big image of myself, and that's gonna take that down for a second because that makes me uncomfortable.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, you're good.
I pinned these for everyone so we can focus on you.
Yeah, it's just kind of funny. I'm like looking at a big mirror. But for me, it was, I think like everybody or many people who do this kind of work, it starts from a very personal place. I was really fortunate that my family kind of did a lot of altruistic activities. We grew up in Louisiana, and so there was a lot of natural disasters that would take out houses, and we would go rebuild houses, and we did charity on a regular basis. They would take me to soup kitchens, and we had a kind of Catholic upbringing, and so that sort of was a primer. But then the big sort of kicker event was in my like early preteens, teens. My extended family really suffered from the opioid epidemic, and I had some family members who overdosed and left one of my cousins kind of in a really precarious situation without parents. And sitting with that and realizing like, oh, it's not just him, it's all of these children all over the place that are going to be born in situations where it feels like actually insurmountable for them to be able to pull themselves out of this situation. And how do you address that? Like I remember sitting in my birthday, like just like thinking about, oh, I'm quite fortunate, but there are going to be all these kids who are in situations that are just sort of ethically unacceptable. How would you address that? And I had sort of my like first miniature systems change insight of, oh, you need universal access to high quality education, and that would level the playing field and give everybody a sort of equal chance to get out of their sort of precarious upbringings. And so that was sort of my goal from a young age, but really having no idea how you would actually realize that in any meaningful capacity. And so I just sort of wandered aimlessly for years doing volunteer work and service work and trying to figure out how you would actually scale up care and compassion. And I didn't start thinking about the meta crisis. I think a lot of people have this experience of having an intuition or this sort of like gestalt effect of there's something off at a systemic scale, and that there just needs to be an underlying shift. And it wasn't until I stumbled across Noam Chomsky's work in early college, not his linguistics, but his kind of radical political theory. And he had this little book called WMDs and Environmental Catastrophe. And it's this like little tiny book with like white flowers on the cover of it. And it's just a Q&A on that topic. And I remember reading about the many different broken arrow events where there were nuclear failures, where, you know, we accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb and the warhead didn't go off, but the explosives did, or, you know, there was a misreading of the system, and thinking like, oh, this is super precarious. And I remember asking a friend, like, how long do you think we have here in civilization? And he was sort of like, oh, I think it's going to go on in perpetuity. And at the time, I was like, I don't know, maybe 100 or a couple 100 years, but really having no actual intuition. But through reading Chomsky's work, I started to get like focused on civilizational collapse. And I came across a man named Jordan Hall's work at a conference. And Jordan Hall was a close collaborator of Daniel Schmachtenberger's. He was helped running Neurohacker Institute. And I started following Jordan's work, learned about Daniel's work through that avenue. And then Daniel put out a call for research assistants. And I just kind of got lucky that he responded back. And that was in 2017. And that was the start of a fruitful collaboration since then.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the background there. It's always helpful, I think, to have a sense of sort of where our guests are coming from. Cool. Yeah. So would you mind saying a little bit more about some of the meta-crisis projects that you worked on since you got involved with meta-crisis work? And in particular, I think we'd also be interested to hear sort of like what the theory of change is with the projects. Like what did you work on and sort of why?
Yeah, for sure. The first thing that I started to work on was in a research support capacity, and that's a lot of what I have done over the last several years, and this is research support. But the first research project that I was working on was studies of group coherence and kind of group psychology and team effectiveness. And the primary theory there, or why we were focused on that, was, you know, whenever you think about the meta-crisis and you think about the generator functions or the underlying structural causes, you can kind of trace one of the sort of divergence points from sustainability to the initial conditions of the meta-crisis in civilizational scale, where, you know, when you're in a relatively small tribe, you can see everybody's behavior. You can actually have an experience of trust with other people in a way that's deeply embodied, and you know, because you're watching everybody and you're telling stories and you're together around the campfire and you're singing and you're hunting together, that people actually have your best interests at heart in a really deeply embodied way. Whereas whenever you get beyond a certain point of scale, you can no longer do that kind of group coordination, and you require certain methods of coordination that often lead towards kind of coercive actions, surveillance, policing, and things like that. And so how do you reproduce the kinds of group coherence that would kind of more closely approximate those that were our initial conditions, but in the modern environment, was sort of one of the underlying questions there. And this connects somewhat tangentially, but also in a deep way, to some of the other projects that I worked on, like at the Consilience papers, or the Center for Humane Technology had a course called The Foundations for Humane Technology that I worked on together with Randy Fernando, one of the other co-founders of the org. And the principle in very different projects, but there's a sort of related principle, which is the meta-crisis has these two attractor basins, right? You have the chaos attractor and the oppression attractor, which we can get into more later. But on the one hand, it's a failure of collective action, right? The chaos attractor is everyone following their own individual self-interest doesn't lead to the necessary collective action required to preserve the commons, required to coordinate on which technologies we want to employ and develop. And so there's collective action failure that drives the chaos attractor. And then the oppression attractor has this quality of, in some ways, a radical form of coordination, but actually from a standpoint of a hierarchical control system that ends up being oppressive and coercive. So the third way, the third attractor, would presumably involve some kind of decentralized collective coordination that does not have the characteristics of an oppressive quality, nor does it have the chaotic quality. And so the public education plays, like the Consilience papers or like the Center for Humane Technologies course, are based on the principle that if people have shared epistemic and ethical principles that are guiding their action that have the qualities of a third attractor embedded in them, then of their own volition, they will spontaneously begin to make nudges to the system in their own way. So, we had something like 15,000 or 20,000 technologists and policy advocacy people take the Center for Humane Technologies course. And you have certain principles embedded in the course that now, whenever someone's going to design technology, they're thinking about, how do I track for unintended negative externalities whenever I'm doing this work? How do I make sure that I'm designing, for example, a social media system that promotes collective coordination and shared understanding, as opposed to design specs that drive loss of attention span or political polarization? And so that was sort of the principle there, is basically initiating decentralized collective coordination from a shared basis of action through public education.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I feel like there's a couple things that came up for me there. But I guess to start, maybe I want to go back to what you were talking about with the lessons that we can take from group coherence in sort of the ancestral environment, or when humans were in smaller groups, and trying to bring that to deal with the problems that come in when we scale past, like, our, past the point where we're able to know everybody in the group. What were the main takeaways there, like the main lessons there? Any ideas concretely on how we would actually be able to do that, or what that would look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So whenever you start to do studies in collective intelligence, one of the kind of very basic but quite, in some ways, profound findings is there was this woman named Amy Edmondson, who was, I think, at Harvard Business School, and she actually was a student of Buckminster Fuller's, which is really interesting. She co-authored a book that was kind of explaining Buckminster Fuller's work to a lay audience. And she identified one of the core driving factors of collective intelligence as the experience of psychological safety in a group, which basically operationally boils down to not feeling like you'll be punished for taking learning risks. So there's this baseline underlying layer of psychological safety, which is, if you think about organizational effectiveness, it's not necessarily the first thing that comes to most people's minds of creating a safe culture for taking learning risks, but that's one of the principles. And then there are practices, many different practices, and I know this is something that might already be percolating in the integral altruism field, of different relational practices that, for example, allow people to, like, nonviolent communication was obviously one of the more famous ones, but there's a suite of different types of communicative practices that have different affordances for creating psychological safety, but also for creating insight. So one of the things that I was focused on at the time was, how do you actually get people to ask questions in a group context where their actual primary focus isn't demonstrating competency in answering certain questions, but actually able to explore unknown spaces. And one of the interesting findings there is how freaking hard it is to get adults to ask questions, because we're trained to exist in a state of advocacy, of constantly answering questions and demonstrating competency, that there's a profound level of fear and just ingrained habitual response to stating answers, even when you're like, hey, we're just asking questions here. And there's probably a lot more to say there. I think there's a lot of experiments happening in intentional communities and things of that. And we'll get into that if we start talking about, like, what does convergence towards a third attractor mean? Like, are intentional communities enough? And the answer is, like, yes, and we need both intentional communities and large scale efforts that aren't going to rely on interpersonal interaction, like face to face, but we also can't lose those capacities. So there's a question about, what are we actually willing to? We've lost the capacity to be in interpersonal relationships in community, but it's one of the substrate levels that allows for a coherence and a type of coordination that doesn't rely on coercive action, for example. So this would be some of the initial directions.
Yeah, That makes a lot of sense because I think, there's like a vulnerability, I think, in admitting that you don't know or in being uncertain. Or just, in doing that sort of explorative learning as opposed to just like drilling out answers and to feel one needs to feel safe to be vulnerable in that way. So I see how it ties back into what you were saying about feeling safe, like needing to feel safe in a group to be able to be vulnerable in that way and open to learning new things.
Totally.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, if you don't mind, if we just shift gears here a little bit. So I think one thing as we've been coalescing around integral altruism and sort of our shared principles here, one question that keeps coming up is just basically like, what do we do concretely? So we take the meta crisis seriously. We also think that the standard sort of effective altruist toolkit for picking causes and interventions is not sufficient for a problem shaped like this. Which I think can leave a lot of hesitancy and like about what to actually commit to. So I guess the basic question here is something like, how do you decide what to work on when you can't rank the options by expected value? Or like, how do you think about sort of cause identification, prioritization, intervention identification, prioritization?
Totally. First thing I want to note in that is I have some familiarity with effective altruism, but I wouldn't say that I'm deeply steeped in the language. And so anything that I say in response shouldn't be taken as a critique of any particular methodology or model, but mostly just my kind of idiosyncratic response. And then the next thing is I'm curious, to answer that, I want to give a little bit of my understanding of the meta-crisis model as a whole to be able to get in. And I don't see everybody's faces, so I don't know the level of relative familiarity. So if I say things that everybody already knows, I apologize in advance, but just to give everybody some shared language that we can use later on down the line, I want to get into a little bit of how I understand the model. So the way that I understand the model and the kind of way I construct it is historically humans have solved problems in ways that often create more complex consequential problems as a result. So some of the classic examples I like to give are, you make industrial fertilizers and you solve a problem associated with relative resource scarcity. But then in the process, you create oceanic dead zones and a whole host of other environmental problems that are associated with that. We actually solved the problem of radical insecurity in the creation of the nuclear bomb as a response to what felt like an imminent risk from Nazi Germany developing it. But then in the process, we created a world where the total ceiling on insecurity was greater because of the existence of nuclear weapons. So historically, humans have solved problems in ways that create more problems. Then you cross a certain threshold where the consequences of the problems that humans have solved end up becoming global catastrophic and existential risks. And so that necessitates a different mode of problem solving that doesn't have the same type of unintended negative consequences, because we've essentially like kicked the can down the road where now the can is the size of the planet and it's an asteroid coming toward us, right? So there's a way of solving problems that has to shift. One of those is the identification of the interdependence of the different problems that we're facing. And this is often talked about under the banner of the polycrisis frame, right? So you have all of these different global catastrophic risks. You have these wicked problems like inequality. You have dystopic risks like surveillance. So let's just name a couple. You have runaway AI risk. You have environmental catastrophes of a bunch of different kinds, climate being one amongst many. You have inequality, risk of technological surveillance. These all have radical interdependencies. You can't actually address AI risk whenever people think that the way that you solve the environmental crisis is through developments in AI. You can't address military de-escalation whenever everyone's saying, well, if they continue to develop AI weapons, then we have to as well, and you get this arms race dynamic. So you have these interdependencies, and then you have underlying generative dynamics or generator functions that give rise to those. So one of them classically is like the multipolar trap or the social trap, these prisoner dilemma situations where if I don't race to develop a more advanced weapon and they do, then they will win. Therefore, there's a pattern of mutual amplification and escalation of everyone racing to develop more advanced weaponry, even as no one is getting a relative advantage from the situation. So you're increasing risk without increasing reward. So you get these situations where everyone following their own individual self-interests ends up creating a worse outcome for everybody. So that's one classic gender dynamic. Another is what we call like narrow metric optimization, which is you have a very narrowly defined measurement of success, be it shareholder returns or gross domestic product, or even if it's in a cause area that's quote unquote altruistic, if your metric of return that you're focused on is minimizing carbon output because you're focused on climate, but then you're not accounting for biodiversity loss, you're going to actually potentially succeed at that goal of minimizing carbon output, but in a way that might lead to biodiversity loss, which crosses other kinds of planetary boundaries that are catastrophic. So these are some of the basic models. You have the risk landscape it's kind of, if you think about it as a quadrant, it's like you have the risk landscape here, there are interdependencies. This is kind of the polycrisis model. And then you have the underlying structural causes or the gender dynamics that give rise to those. And there's feedback loops between those processes. And that gives you the kind of metacrisis model as I understand it. So then the question is, how do you do prioritization in the context of that massive scope of a challenge? And I like to get to this question through a little bit of a thought experiment, which is like, if you imagine you're an environmentalist and you set the goal of, I'm going to do massive public media campaigns that get everybody to transition from fossil fuel-based cars to electric vehicles. Or I'm going to instantiate a rights of nature legal framework in the Constitution that actually gives, instead of just giving corporations and human persons personhood, I'm going to give personhood rights to natural entities. Or actually what I think is the biggest issue is that people don't have a spiritual or psychological connection to nature. Therefore, I'm going to do ecotourism that has a eco-spiritual connection project. Each of these could radically succeed on their own terms, and the state of the environment could radically degrade as a result. Because, for example, one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels is actually the defense industry, right? So if you don't actually account for geopolitical conflict escalation, then you might make radical success on all these other measures and not move the needle at all. And so there's something like irreducibly necessary conditions for the continued maintenance of civilization and of the biosphere, that where relative cause prioritization based on effective utility no longer becomes the exact tool. But I will say that it will be one of many different tools. And whenever we're thinking, actually real quick, it's worth noting that those other interventions are actually totally important and necessary. That's the kind of confusing thing, is that we do need public media campaigns that change consumer behavior. We do need legal frameworks that create rights of nature and actually give a legal backing for conservation efforts on behalf of the personhood of different species and ecological entities. And we do need people to likely have an experience of the intrinsic value of nature, so that beyond just legal deterrence or economic incentives, that there is an intrinsic motivation to preserving and caring for nature. But on their own terms, these might be necessary, but they might not be sufficient for the problem at hand. So thinking in terms of necessity and sufficiency is one way that I think about it. The idea of kind of cost-benefit analysis, looking at return on investment, is going to be a frame that I think is valuable in some respects, in a narrow respect. But one of the ways I like to think about this is, often when we're thinking about those frames, we use frames like 80-20. How do you get 80% of the value from 20% of the effort? Or what 20% of interventions get 80% of the output? And that's a very natural way to think about the problem, given the way that we've been trained to think in traditional schooling models. If you think about ecological or biological systems, the reasoning starts to kind of fall apart a little bit, because if you ask yourself, which 20% of my organs do 80% of the work, it starts to be a little bit wonky. You're like, maybe I want to keep my heart, maybe I want to keep my brain, but if you don't have your liver and your kidneys and your colon or your skin, it's going to go pretty bad pretty quickly. And the same is true with most of the cause areas that we're considering in the context of the meta crisis, is that they are just necessary to be maintained, and that it's not like a gradient of return on investment of I get a relatively higher distribution of returns from investing in this cause area, this cause area. It's binary. If we don't stop crossing planetary boundaries of a certain kind, we just don't make it. If we don't stop misaligned recursive self-improvement and runaway misaligned superintelligence, we just don't make it. And so that's sort of the first concept, is what might be called irreducibly necessary conditions. Then even within that, there are then methods for prioritization, or how to think about what to do. So there are several ways in here. The first one I want to start with is thinking about competencies and dispositions. So if you think about an individual actor, and that could be you as an individual, but it could be the group integral altruism, it could be a country, corporation, a coalition. Regardless of the agent's size, each agent is going to have a different set of competencies and a different set of dispositions. So for someone who is very much a people person, is a healer, and their primary orientation is to helping people heal from really deep traumas, and those traumas are actually creating the hungry ghost that motivates people to continue to consume more and to drive towards greater accumulation of power. Or maybe it's someone in the context of AI development who their primary motivation is actually, I want to create a digital god because I would like to be the person who does that. And that comes from a kind of motivational structure that is deeply wounded. And there's actually a lot of people who share that. And that's not a judgment on those people. It's just an observation of, given the context in which we grew up, a lot of us are deeply wounded. And so there's a group of people who are oriented towards healing and supporting those people. I wouldn't make a request of someone who has that disposition to go learn technical AI safety work. But I would say, if you're oriented to technical AI safety work, there's a lot of technical AI safety work to be done. And that's true at the individual level, but it's also true at the scale of a firm or a country. Like, different countries have different dispositions because they have different cultural identities and they have different competencies. For example, because of a geographical location, they literally have access to different resources. And if you look at the history of empire, you look at the history of international development, like, why was the British Empire the British Empire? It was because of their naval fleet. They had a unique competency towards their navy, but they didn't fight land wars in the same way. And so there's a way to think about that principle in a kind of scaled fashion, even as the suggested interventions are being constrained by this higher order map of the meta crisis as a whole. So that's competencies and dispositions. Then there's something like time sequencing. So this is thinking about the order in which certain events must occur. So if I'm comparing, for example, the unbelievable suffering that's happening in factory farms with the risk of misaligned superintelligence. I actually, from an ethical standpoint, I don't want to compare them as in one is more or less acceptable than other, because I think that they are comparably two features of the world that I don't want to live in. And I actually don't want to have to make a kind of nominal comparison of which one it has greater ethical standing for you to work on. I want to say, okay, I think factory farms are abhorrent, and I think the fact that 94% of the animals on Earth live in factory farms is just not an acceptable state. I would like people to shift that dynamic. Runaway recursive self-improvement on 12 to 24-month timelines is a little bit more imminent in terms of it forecloses the possibility of us doing work on the other area. So there is a relative prioritization. Again, you have to factor the competencies and the dispositions. Some people are just not oriented to working on stopping recursive self-improvement, and they're much more oriented to working on factory farms, and I would support them to continue to do that. But if I'm looking at from like a macro scale of where we need to, as a civilization as a whole, disproportionately focus to make sure that we slow, bind, and redirect the current trajectory of technological acceleration, I would say, okay, we definitely need to make sure that we tend to recursive self-improvement first, because even though I think factory farms are unacceptable, there's not an imminent timeline on that exactly. So that's that point. Worth noting, there are a number of kind of what I call kind of catastrophic red lines, these tipping points, these points of no return where, you know, if you cross this point, it just foreclosed all the future possibilities. There are a number of them that are at the scale of consequence or comparable scale of consequence to misaligned superintelligence that may be as timely, and we just don't know. So, for example, there are a number of planetary boundaries that you could cross a certain state of chemical pollution that leads to mass die-off of phytoplankton in the ocean that produces all of the oxygen. And we have no, or I don't want to say we have no idea, but the range of uncertainty is quite high. And so it's actually not effective epistemically to say that one is more timely than another, because the relative degree of uncertainty is high enough that we don't know, and the consequentiality of it is forecloses all future possibilities. And so there's like a relative, a degree of prioritization because of that uncertainty. So that's kind of the timeliness principle. And then there's another principle of finding synergistic bottleneck openers. So if you imagine you have two programs that you're considering investing in. On the one hand, you have this project, I'm going to do meta-crisis education for youth, because actually I realize that the meta-crisis conditions humans to act in certain ways where they optimize for very narrow goals that externalize harm to the whole. I want to raise my children to be able to perceive the intrinsic value of nature, to be able to have a deeply embodied sense of how to act and interact in complex systems. I want them to have, from the time they're born, conditions in which their natural perception and spontaneously arising action is net beneficial. You know, like that's a really powerful intervention. And then you have this other project, which is I want to make a meta-crisis course for graduate schools. And that one, in terms of like total leverage from the standpoint of like you're given a 2-year program versus like you're raising kids completely differently, it's not as totally powerful as the raising kids from birth, but actually it gives you staff members, it gives you people who are knowledgeable about the meta-crisis within 2 years as opposed to 25 years, and they can help design the curriculum for the children, and they can also help you do work on a whole bunch of other areas. And so from the standpoint of like, actually, if I choose this project first, I can satisfy the other one faster and do other things. So there's a synergistic property that opens up more bottlenecks. And so that's another kind of principle of prioritization. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pause, because I know I've said a lot, is that you can see how many different roles there are within the context of this work. And most people are not oriented to doing the meta-systemic mapping of all of the different interdependencies and underlying dynamics in the context of the meta-crisis. A lot of people want to do hands-on care work. A lot of people want to solve technical problems or write law or focus on, you know, knocking door to door and doing public advocacy campaigns. And this relative distribution of labor is just going to be part of the dynamic. And if you look at other institutions that have kind of whole world focuses as their mandate, like a government, they will have a different distribution of kinds of activities where there's maybe one entity. For example, in the U.S. Defense establishment, there's this entity called the Office of Net Assessment that is just like a small little think tank where their primary goal is looking at, does the total distribution of available resources and strategies converge on U.S. supremacy, right? And now that's obviously not the suggestion in this context. It's, does the totality of these activities that we just laid out converge to sufficiency on addressing the meta crisis? And someone who's working on technical AI safety work is not necessarily doing the metasystemic map of, okay, I'm doing technical AI safety work. That person over there is doing eco-spiritual retreats. That person over there is doing therapy. Do the total set of activities converge? Now, some groups and people need to be responsible for that kind of activity, and there's a coordination function between these different entities where it's almost like analogous a little bit to a relay race or something like that, where you're handing off the baton, where your work is an input into a broader function. And some of those are through conscious coordinated action, and others are through like just the distributed action of a bunch of people. But there will be some instance where, like, if you are doing say mechanistic interpretability, or you're trying to build AI systems that don't display deceptive alignment, if you build a really effective model for that, but you aren't in coordination with the legislators who's doing litigation on AI liability, or who are writing legislation to actually make the scrutability of AI systems a necessary prerequisite for integration into certain technical systems, then you may design a system that is far safer, but basically becomes the equivalent of organic food to industrial agriculture, which is like, yeah, you have a little niche that you carved out, but ultimately the overall topology and distribution of incentives in the system are still driving in the direction of misalignment. So you have to be in coordination with, I know that my piece on its own is necessary but insufficient. How am I in coordination with other actors to get towards sufficiency towards this challenge?
Amazing. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the tons of stuff that you've given us to chew on there. I mean, there were a few things that were coming up for me, but in the interest of time, let me just sort of maybe zero in on one follow-up question here, and then I'll have another question or two quickly, and then we can open up to the group. So yeah, sort of when you were talking about bright red lines or points of no return, sort of like the original question kind of recurred for me again, in the sense of like, okay, so if there's multiple potential points of no return and we're uncertain exactly like how close we are to the various ones, how in the, like, so there's some uncertainty where it's like this one may or may not be closer than this other one. Like, I get that in the aggregate, right? We want people to be working, like some people to be working on both, but on the level of like an individual, or even for individual firms, or even civilization as a whole, how should we think then about, yeah, priority, like splitting resources, or like if I'm like, okay, I could work on AI, or I could work on, you know, the sort of the chemical pollution phytoplankton problem that you were describing, accepting, of course, what you were saying about personal abilities, skills, or inclinations. Like maybe I'm better suited to work on AI safety, for example. But all that aside, like there still needs to be like individuals, firms, nations, and humanity collectively needs to make some decisions on how to actually prioritize between these things. And how should we do that, given that there is like some uncertainty there about like what we're actually closest to crossing as a point of no return?
Yeah, totally. I think it's worth noting that whenever you start to think about investments at the level of the civilization as a whole, you're making some interesting presumptions about what are actually available options at this point. So I like to try and think about, like, if I was, I don't know, running a massive institution and I had trillions of dollars under management, I would think very differently than if I was in a local position and I'm primarily focused on research and my input is into this much broader system. I also think about it a little bit like, in some ways, it's massively complex and seemingly intractable. And in others, it's like, we have a number of different irreducible needs that we have. Like, I have to eat, I have to sleep, I have to spend time with friends, I have to go to the bathroom. Like, I have basic biological functions that I don't negate whenever they arise. And so, in some ways, the multiple prioritization function is something that's kind of intuitive. But whenever then we try to think about it at the scale of like an entire civilization and all of the available resources, it gets quite funky. And so I generally like to think about it from like the vantage point of, what do you have access to in your resource kit? And what are the particular issues that you are feeling called to work on? And then if you, for example, I know that you have an interest in AI safety and you have a background in technical safety work. And so my suggestion would be to put you in a position where your work had greater leverage towards the ultimate goals that you have. But if you had hundreds of millions of dollars under management and you were trying to look at a portfolio of things, I would be in communication with you differently based on your available affordance set. And that would include, for example, like if you're an investor, but you're really interested in environmentalism and actually you have expertise in environmentalism, then in some ways it would be challenging to advocate for you to invest a lot more in a cause area that you don't have a lot of expertise in, because you might be more susceptible to making certain mistakes. And so I'm sort of realizing that I'm bypassing your question slightly, but in the interest of trying to think, I think we all have this impulse to try and get on top of the problem and look at it as if we can look at the whole system from outside of it. And I'm just sort of encouraging us to like come back and actually, you're here in it, and like, what's your relative available option set and your relationships? And there's I have existing relationships, I have existing resources, I have existing capabilities. I am also a becoming being. I can change, I can grow my network, I can grow my competency set. That's when you start to do the, flip from being on the inside to being on the outside. And like, okay, you're making your own competencies and your own dispositions and your own resources the object of reflection. And you're like, okay, I'm good at technical AI safety work, but I'm actually not a good kind of public communicator to the degree that I could convince the public that they need to focus on this. So I'm going to go and I'm going to either build those competencies myself, or I'm going to partner with a firm that does that work in order to amplify the effectiveness from taking that whole systemic lens.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, let me look at my questions here. Okay, yeah, I'll skip over a couple of the questions just in the interest of time.
Yeah, I would
I
love
had a
to
question
give
about
like 30 minutes of Q&A if
for sure. Yeah, I had a question about the third attractor, but I might skip over that now because I just wanted to ask a question too about AI in particular, before we open it up to the group. So I guess, and we've sort of touched upon this with maybe in parts with the other questions, but just generally, I guess I'm interested in sort of how does AI figure into your picture of the meta crisis? Like, do you see the risk there as primarily like just another powerful technology being misused due to the underlying dynamics of the meta crisis, or is there something like unique or particular to the AI case there? And I guess just as like an intuition pump for this question, maybe like when you picture AI going badly, what's the failure that worries you the most? Like a lot of people here, for example, or in the EA community, would be most worried about loss of control due to misaligned AI or superintelligence. But other perspectives, for example, might focus on AI deepening sort of the meta crisis dynamics already in motion, like extraction, surveillance, concentration of power, degraded information commons and sense-making abilities, et cetera. So I'm just sort of wondering, yeah, how you hold those different things, and yeah, sort of what concerns you the most and how it should figure into sort of how we think about the meta crisis overall.
Totally. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think there's a kind of common practice I like to employ when I'm thinking about questions like this, which is to look at both how challenges we're facing today are continuous and discontinuous with the past. So the discontinuity is in some ways quite obvious. Like, we have designed a technology that we don't understand, right? That we're not relying upon in a really systematic way. And there is a discontinuity with prior to the mid 20th century, the definition of a technology was almost that we had a deterministic blueprint of how to operate it. And, even in the Newtonian paradigm, it's quite obvious and apparent that we have like a very kind of classical mechanical understanding of a system that we're designing. But even in the context of nuclear weapons and relativistic technologies, we understand the mechanisms at work very clearly, and there is a kind of deterministic input-output dynamic that we can control. Once you get the complexity sciences and the kind of formal study of self-organization and emergent behavior, and you start to design statistical learning systems where you can't actually track what's going on in them, that's a pretty novel shift, and that's worth noting. At the same time, there's a continuity. And I know Daniel Schmachtenberger has talked about this before. He did it on Liv Bowery's podcast, but thinking about civilization itself as an already existing misaligned superintelligence, which, the context of the meta crisis as a whole can be understood as we have a system that's driving outcomes that are misaligned with human well-being and the well-being of the biosphere as a whole that nobody's in control of, but everyone seems to be participating in. There's also this quote from the philosopher Nick Land, which has gotten a lot of popularity, which is, capitalism can be viewed as an alien invasion from an artificially intelligent space assembling itself from its enemy's resources, which is the idea of like, okay, if you look, Land is an interesting character for many reasons, but the basic point there is that if you look at the history of the market, it is the continuous incentivization for humans to build machines that automate their labor. And there's a kind of gradual disintermediation of human action in the system where, Land makes this point in this podcast on, I think it's called Theory Underground, his podcast, where he says, capitalism has very little interest in making hamburgers. It doesn't really care that much about making hamburgers and ice cream. It serves that function as a means of incentivizing workers to build machines. And this is a very higher order view of the system that kind of attributes a kind of agency to this entity. And you can take that literally, you can take it metaphorically. I don't have a super strong leaning one way or the other. But the idea that this is true even prior to capitalism, that there's a gradual history of basically trying to mechanize the organic. So as soon as you start to basically do sedentary agriculture, you take what is like a really, really diverse range of skill sets in diets of the hunter and gatherer tribe, and you narrow them profoundly to a handful of kind of crops that radically simplify the diet and the travel patterns of the hunter-gatherer class. Then when you get the state, like the early formation of the state, it reduces the complexity of the human behavior radically because it makes everyone have to produce grain, for example, over other crops. Why do they produce grain rather than other crops? Because grains are more easily taxable because they grow in regular cycles. The taxman can regularly come at certain intervals of time. And so it creates a kind of rhythmicity that's predictable and controllable. So you take what is a radically subjective, uncertain, ecologically complex system and you mechanize it. And so Lewis Mumford, who was a philosopher of technology, called these early states, these systems, mega machines. And because they operate very much like a socially engineered machine. And So there's this gradual process of mechanizing organic systems that is continuous with AI, even as AI is kind of like the apex ultimate culmination of it. There's plenty more to say on that front, but I want to also answer what are my kind of primary concerns? Is it runaway control? I mentioned that one a lot in the previous last few minutes, but I think it's similar to how I was talking about the relative comparison between crossing certain planetary boundaries and recursive self-improvement. It's quite possible that we reach a kind of lock-in state of ubiquitous technological surveillance prior to a certain level of recursive self-improvement, misaligned superintelligence. It's also possible that the drive towards superintelligence initiates global conflict at a scale that is unacceptable. And those three, alongside also like technological feudalism, where you have large-scale automation and the creation of a massive underclass that is basically feudal in nature, but where the serfs aren't necessary because their labor is replaced with robots. Those different outcomes are in some ways equally concerning or comparably concerning to me as misaligned superintelligence.
Great, very thoughtful and well-reasoned response there. Great. So I think at this point I would love to open it up to the group. So what I'll say is that in general, anybody feel free to unmute and just jump in. If you have a question that you want to flag while somebody else is asking the question or Chris is responding, you can like raise your hand, and then I can call on you in order. Also, Chris, I know that you said something like you might want to do it a little bit more sort of group discussion style.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, so I'll kind of leave it to you to sort of
I'm happy
facilitate how you want to, or maybe prompt the group, whatever. But with that, I guess I'll just open up to the group. So happy to welcome any questions from people here. David?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the great talk. It's very insightful, and I really like also the definition of like certain concepts that you then give a name to, which is really good for sort of keeping them in mind and also communicating them further. So one thing I'm really interested in is this concept of sort of necessary action, and how to sort of gather enough proof that you can actually convince sort of either policymakers or investors to actually take these necessary actions, especially if there's something that they wouldn't want to do. And I also think there's like a hierarchical stage to these in the sense that there's some necessary actions that are easier to communicate in the sense, okay, you need to do A such that sort of outcome B just doesn't straight up happen. But then there's these much harder to communicate and prove concepts like the sort of underlying dynamics in the sense that a certain dynamic, like for instance, like very strong national competition might just create too much risk in a current world setting that this needs to be mitigated. There needs to be sort of, for instance, more communication, but proving that as a necessary action to countries such that they actually have to do this, even though they might not want to from many other sort of game theoretical perspectives, that is very difficult. And sort of, so I want to get your insight on how to, like, first of all, how much do you think there might be these higher order structural changes that we actually really need to do now, maybe within the next 1 or 2 years, depending on also how fast the AI timelines are, and how to go about sort of creating this proof with maybe like dozens of researchers, or not dozens, like hundreds of researchers, sort of creating a general framework of how to maybe get not 100% proof, but get a sufficiently enough proof to actually convince world leaders to make a certain change.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for that. So there was a framework, and I'm not sure if folks are familiar with it, but I know that Daniel Schmachterberger and other people in the metacrisis space have used before of like triage, transition, and transformation timelines of intervention. So I'll use that real quick and then to tie into what you were saying. So you can think about 3 timelines of action for moving from like the 2 attractor state to the 3rd attractor state. Triage type work is basically what it sounds like. It's like stop the bleeding. There are these do not cross points, these red lines. We named a bunch of them. Triage type work is work that's just prevent that and buy time. Transformation work is that longer term stuff. It's like, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a long-term viable civilization that is in enduring harmonious relationship with the biosphere and has a mature relationship to advanced technology. Transition work is the iterative moving from triage state to transformation state, where you're just like, where are the generative dynamics embedded in certain parts of the system that you can just nudge at varying degrees of difficulty. So like one kind of easy example to understand is like, got to get money out of campaign finance. Can't have electioneering money dominate politics to the degree that there's no correspondence with public will and public policy beyond lobbying dollars. That doesn't work anymore. And that's a relatively tractable, it's difficult, but it's actually historically not unprecedented. And so there are different tiers of, like you're saying, a hierarchy of relative difficulty. And the triage work does, usually you can appeal to people's self-interests in a way that is harder for the transformation work. Even in cases that seem kind of complicated. Like the military, for example, probably doesn't want uncontrollable AI systems. It might be the experience of pressure to adopt technologies because they give you competitive advantage, but ultimately when those technologies prove to be not easily controllable, there's a direct incentive that's a national security imperative. And so there's a way, like you're saying, to appeal to the relative self-interest of actors that is actually in alignment with the whole interest. And so that's one thing on that front. And then that's still true for various steps along that triage transition transformation timeline, where there are a number of political actors who would be in support, even if you're ever just strictly acting from self-interest, to take election campaigning money out of politics, because it's actually, there is a strong political and public will for getting money out of politics. Now, there's also a lot of energy invested in the other side, but that is a self-interested strategic play, is to make appeals to super majority positions that are widely generally acceptable. This is also true with AI, is actually you're seeing a pretty significant degree of public discontent with the current development of AI. And if you look at Gallup polls and other large-scale polls, the number of people and percentage of people who want to slow down, want certain kinds of safety regulations is definitely the majority. And it's a relatively small minority otherwise, but if you can galvanize the kind of public political will to support just widely accepted supermajority positions, I think that's one of the principles.
Nice. Yeah, okay, I have like a very quick follow-up. So in some sense, like the idea of galvanizing sort of superpositions and sort of using the maybe the narrative in some sense to actually gather support, so circumvents a little bit this burden of proof, because the burden of proof to me is more of an idea of like, when are you trying to act against forces that are in theory too strong? Like we have things that we wanted to change for like 50 years, but we never get to it because it's just, there's not enough coordination in the population to actually make the changes. Like, for instance, maybe tax havens could be an example like that, where we all agree they should have been erased like decades ago, but there's just nationally no coordination to really do it, and no mechanism. But like, how to create the circumstances there where you can have also sufficient intellectual and scientific understanding that you can really say, okay, this is the action that needs to be taken place. And then from that position of sort of scientific strength, convince also the more general public to put that much, like put so much pressure beyond even the normal narratives on politicians, that there really is no other way than to change the big movements.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, the short answer is I don't have a super confident answer or definitive answer. I think it's worth noting that I don't think that there's a lot of reason to believe that political action unfolds because of rationality. I think that it's important to have the evidentiary basis and the reasoning, but it's insufficient. I think you also have to appeal to, like, a lot of people, for example, don't focus on the metasystemic issues because they care really about local issues. Like, you actually have a lot of motivation and energy, for example, for mothers who have lost their children to suicide from social media or AI usage, chatbot AI usage. And it's less a rationality and then an appeal to, like, your emotional conviction. And in the current system, until you get to a point where people's naturally spontaneously arising motivations are in alignment with the whole, which seems quite distant, there is a degree of appeal to self-interest on the part of representatives that feels like this isn't true for all representatives. And there are cases where there are genuinely earnest and ethical political actors, but overarchingly, unless there is a constituency that's driving it, like you're saying, which involves both the scientific and the philosophical reasoning, but also the logos and the pathos, right? The emotional appeal as well. And then that constituency also has to have the coordination capacity to ensure that what the representatives were elected on the basis of, they actually institute policy that's in accordance with what they were elected on, which might involve, for example, technical systems design, where you have, like, correlation between public will and public policy, transparency audits, where you have platforms where that's their entire purpose, is that this person got elected on the basis of this policy based on their constituency preferences. They should just be like a dog in the fight on that particular issue in their position. And if they're not, then something else happened and they should be booted out. And that should be in some way automatically updated from a technical platform and then communicated out to the constituency basis.
That's a very nice idea, yeah.
Nate?
Let's go to Nate, yeah.
Yeah, just really appreciating this entire conversation. Thank you, Chris. And I just want to check that my audio is working, first of all.
It's great.
Yeah.
It's probably better than mine.
Great. No, you sound great. Just in a cafe, so you know. Okay. Wow, where do I start? Whole world focus as a mission, questions of kind of systematicity, locality. Okay. So I'm thinking a lot about what, for lack of language, I would call like polity constitution. Like, how does a body politic emerge? How do groups? Mm-hmm. So, and this is of course, connected in the frame of collective intelligence as a concern, but it seems to me that we're kind of oscillating between looking at that through the lens of almost like a anthropological or ethnographic kind of concern in nature, and like, how do we solve that dimension of the issue, versus more of the material structural concern, and in terms of like the scope of the issues that, you know, we generally gesture towards with the polycrisis analysis you provided. And behind all of that is a certain kind of intersubjective process that's part of this interbecoming you were speaking to, where, like, as nervous systems collectively and interpersonally and as selves, we're constantly working through like a self-constitution and asking questions of the terms of that process within ourselves. And so it's giving rise for me to a question of, like, if you're appealing to the need for coherence as part of the theory of change, do we understand the nature of almost like what kind of language affordances we need to be able to do the knowledge translation, the knowledge mobilization for interbecoming? Because even something like, oh, we need new legal frameworks to consider personhoods for, you know, well, actually, we need legal frameworks to consider personhoods, period, right? The second that the legibility of my own participation in positionality in this change project doesn't work for some other group, then I'm like that, then the legitimacy and the legibility are kind of in that dance, right? So dehumanizing, depersoning people is the current state of affairs. And as a result, I think our capacity for collective intelligence is also constrained by that. And I don't think we understand the metabolic process of personhood that underpins our capacity to address this issue of collective intelligence. So I'm not sure exactly how best to frame this. I'm actually trying to figure out, is this like a grammatical concern? Like, what are lenses that would help us explore what it means to actually build a more robust capacity for bridging the locality of the concern and the collective, like, multi-group concern that I think you're pointing at. Whatever comes up for you as you're responding to that.
So much. That's beautiful. I feel like I have a less of a very pointed response than just a ton of different things kind of came up simultaneously. I mean, the first thing that comes up when you were saying like what constitutes a polity is interesting, because I know this is something Jack and I spoke a little bit about prior, which is like the two attractors is often defined negatively as neither chaos nor oppression. And so like, why is it defined negatively? It's defined negatively intentionally to create the minimum viable conditions for agreement that like these are two outcomes that we don't want, and there are global catastrophic risks that threaten to put us into one of two or both of those attractor states. And so the formation of a polity, so John Dewey wrote in this book called The Public and Its Problems that the creation of a public arises whenever the consequences of one another's actions become significant to enough degree that those individuals in that group must coordinate with one another in order to not have negative consequences from private actions cascade out into the public. So the creation of shared agreement from the experience of shared fate, right, is one of the ways to think about it. So the two attractors and the need for global governance, not global government, but like coordination at a planetary scale, says actually very little about how we should relate to one another on an interpersonal relationship in a local context. It says like, okay, there are certain like do not cross points that apparently at this stage in the game require planetary coordination at some scale, but like the principle of subsidiarity of you resolve social challenges at the smallest scale that the resolution is possible is true. And so that's one of the first things that came up. The grammar of personhood and the issue that actually like people are now talking about personhood for AI when historically personhood for a lot of groups just never existed. So like there's like a retroactive, we need to correct the record, folks. Like, all human beings are made equal in the founding of the US Constitution, and yet there were whole groups that were excluded from that conversation, is obviously one of those areas that there needs to be a different kind of grammar, like you're saying, like what do we actually include? What is included in the context of the concept of the person? I think there's also an area of innovation that I feel is necessary in what are the kinds of communicative practices that enable a recognition of shared ethical commitments where there appear to be irreducible cultural differences. That seems like an extremely important focus area that I don't think there's no obvious response from my vantage point. There's something like, if you have different cultures who have at their basic cultural definitions that, for example, cultures that have in their historical lineages and stories the idea of just basic cultural superiority relative to others, you're gonna generate a lot of conflict just intrinsic to that. So there's something of a reconciliation or a reconfiguration of the basic cultural narratives that generate conflict. But then there's also something like cultural and dialogical processes that have demonstrated success at addressing dehumanization. So one of the groups that had a good deal of success in this in the context of the US at least, was called Better Angels. And there are a number of groups like this where, and this is the place I would look for, like at the kind of where the rubber meets the road in this question, is not so much a theoretical grammar, even though I think it's completely important and relevant, but the actual conflict resolution and interpersonal relating processes that have the highest levels of success. And Better Angels is one of them. Marshall Rosenberg of Nonviolent Communication had a lot of really interesting success cases where he would go into the most egregious conflict-prone zones where there's genocide between groups taking place, and he would get them to identify between what's the need that you're really missing, and how do you actually get the other group to understand the need and not mistake it for the strategy that's being proposed. So that's kind of a wandering response to a question that I think is just a provocation for deeper inquiry. Patrick.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for the great talk and explanation. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper on the aspect of prioritization, especially looking from the integral altruism lens. We're trying to bridge two fields, effective altruism worldview with meta crisis and other worldviews. One thing that surprises me surprised me also in your description, that there is a lot of overlap. There's a lot of similar thinking around an organization where we help people think about their careers, especially in terms of AI risk, and a lot of the aspects on prioritizing the careers are similar things. So I was wondering, is there a meta crisis area that thinks similarly around giving people advice around careers, but then also another field I think where effective altruism has been very strong is philanthropy advisory, getting people with the kind of resources to enable them to prioritize between the different areas. And the way you describe prioritization, that should be possible to find ways to do that. So are you aware of people doing that in these spaces?
I think it's definitely an underutilized area, for sure. I personally am not aware of a ton of groups who are taking these frameworks and embedding them in, for example, either something that's comparable to an 80,000 hours. I think that is something that would be worthwhile to happen. I don't know of anything that exists. Similarly I don't know any particular philanthropic initiatives that are taking these frameworks in. I will say that I think, to the point that I made at the very beginning of the conversation where I was saying, we put out these frameworks, say, for example, in the Consilience papers, and then people just go and do things on their own accord. I have had conversations, actually in the context I met Jack in, I met a gentleman who was running a medium-sized venture capital firm that was taking some of the frameworks of how do you do investment in ways that does what we call yellow teaming, which is instead of red teaming, which is looking at how adversaries can break your system, yellow teaming is if things went successfully, what are the potential negative externalities across different dimensions? And there's a procedural set of questions and a structured assessment that you can ask for any given initiative, and that's outlined in this paper on the Consilience Project website called Progress and Development. And I talked to this gentleman, and he actually was taking that framework as he understood it and embedding it in his VC process. And so I imagine it would be great if something similar happened in the context of prioritization and the identification of potentially synergistic opportunities, but I haven't seen a lot of cases of it.
I would have one follow-up on that, which would be sort of the next step. If, as you say, that would be my next question would be is there actually how much coordination is there around there? I think the EA community, one thing they've been like good in is having an EA forum, having like a central place for people to talk about that, bringing up posts and saying like, oh, this thing is missing, somebody should be doing that. Is there like a similar, and also having community builders and groups and so on, like are there like people like focusing on similar kind of building the kind of capacities of individuals to build projects to, for example, do the things that you were describing?
Yes, and there's a great deal of area of improvement for sure. I would say that I've seen a lot of different. The Metacrisis framework is actually a really interesting attractor for a lot of different kinds of groups. So some of the places where I've seen this kind of coordination happen is actually like the intersection of the crypto and blockchain community with the Metacrisis framework. So Kevin Owocki, who created, I'm actually blanking on the project he made, but he made a platform for essentially crypto-based donations for philanthropic projects. But he has this podcast called Green Pill, and he spun up a project that did basically a decentralized donation platform for Metacrisis-oriented projects, and he coordinated with another gentleman, I think his name is Stephen Reed, who made a platform for Metacrisis coordination, but in the context of the crypto blockchain space. I think there are comparable things happening in, say, like the Life Itself space, which I know some of you are familiar with, and Perspectiva, and a number of these other entities. There's always relative degrees of effective coordination, and I think they could always improve, but I think there are some comparable instances. But EA, it's worth noting, has been being built out for a relatively long period, so the relative degrees of coordination of those communities are different levels of maturity.
Cool, thank you.
Can I ask a personal question real quick, Chris?
Yeah, for sure.
Just around the intersection between the sense-making, co-sensing part of this work and the kind of living in the world as a human, and for myself, I can't speak for anyone else, but I do get a sense that this might be more of a broader cultural challenge we face. Like, there's deep grief that can come up probably even at the most salient moments of intellectual breakthrough. It's like, oh, I'm keying in on an understanding that really matters right now, and actually doing that gives access in some sense to the spiritual proximity or the pieces of that like needed the distance to be safe. And I even wonder if our ability to access the breakthroughs we need is kind of like hitting up against like a capacity to even hold what it is we're working on. Like it's kind of like a Brett Victor's unthinkable thoughts kind of a thing, but with a spiritual dimension to it or a psycho-emotional dimension to it, and like, what's the media for unthinkable thoughts if those thoughts that need to be thought are about our spiritual relationship to this moment? So how are you situating yourself in this conversation and in this work right now, and holding these parts of yourself in relation to the issues you're tackling?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I don't think that you can do this work in a sustained and authentic fashion without tapping into that grief in a pretty profound way. And I'd say sometimes when I'm working, I will just start crying, because it actually, the buildup of numbness is exhausting. Like, if you're actually, one of the generative dynamics that's a little bit tangential is just systematically numbing us from feeling. Like, if you're in nature and I'm fortunate to have, let's see if I can actually show y'all a little bit of where I'm at. It's super beautiful. This is a lot of green and next to me. And when you go outside and you tap into like, oh wait, I am doing this work because that is so beautiful and intrinsically valuable that it's worth all of the life force that I have to give to it. We're similarly like connecting with people like yourselves, where when we're doing this work, because even as difficult it is to collaborate with other humans, like I want to live in that world because it's so potentially beautiful. And the numbness of it's actually too painful to accept the reality of the situation. The only context in which that kind of numbness works is if you're contributing to the problem, because you don't source from the right place the motivation and the intelligence of your actions if it's just coming from a numbed being. And so it's not to say that that doesn't happen a lot, where all of a sudden I'll notice like just an overwhelming like exhaustion because, oh, why am I so exhausted? It's not that I didn't get enough rest or whatever. I haven't been feeling what I'm thinking about or I'm talking about or what we're working on. And then touching into and accessing the grief is actually an opening up of energy. And it's also an opening up of intelligence, because that's part of the argument, is that there's a kind of disproportionate prioritization of a kind of intelligence that is detached from embodied intelligence. And that is a non-biological form of intelligence. That's the mechanistic eating the organic, the system eating the life world, was one of the ways that Habermas talked about it. And I would prefer to be in support of life. And that means that I have to feel all of the things. That's a beautiful question. Thank you.
Strong agree. Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful response as well, Chris. Thanks for sharing. Maybe I have time for one more question here. We can go to Christine.
Cool, thank you. And yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for not just what you're sharing verbally, but the way you're embodying this nuance in your being, and for how you're sharing that with us. And yeah, I think maybe wanted to pick up on also another beautiful thing you shared around education and how we can essentially teach the next generation to live and be from this perspective. I think I'm also curious because I work in the education space with university students, and some of us in the integral autism community are also interested in what a fellowship could look like. And I'm personally interested in models that aren't just purely Haiti discussion based, but can take us through like different ways of knowing and understanding the world. And so, I guess the question is, in envisioning an ideal education around this, potentially more for adults, like the graduate course you're mentioning, I'm curious what that might entail.
Yeah, that's a beautiful and a deep question that would warrant its own long form discussion. I mean, I can say a couple things, which is there is just a very natural division is the wrong word, but a distinction between there's a bunch of cognitive models. There's a number of really critical cognitive models, that many of which we outlined here. And then there are a suite of different kinds of what we might call embodied intelligence, relational intelligence, ecological intelligence practices that would be embedded in that kind of curriculum. There's a lot of work that's already been done in this space, so it's not fully required to recreate the wheel. And there's too many places to point, but just as a shout out to your namesake, Ken Wilber's book on integral life practice was really interesting, where he lays out all of the different dimensions of what an integral life practice would be. I wouldn't say that exhausts the total space of how to build a curriculum in this respect, but he in that methodology will go over, for example, there's depth psychological practices. So there's psychoanalytic and archetypal psychology work. There's now popular concepts like internal family systems, which I've gotten a lot of benefit from. Then there's mindfulness and various meditative and spiritual practices. There's also just increasing the sensitivity of the nervous system and the being, that is also a separate but related phenomenon. That's things like spending time in nature and learning. How do you rewild yourself? Like, how do we actually not lose the wildness? There's a desire, back to the continuity, discontinuity thing. There's discontinuity with nature and with other animals, and that's somewhat obvious. Like, there's no other animals that can do planetary scale geoengineering or build artificially intelligent agents, but there's a ton of continuity, and there's a remembrance of that to be able to re-inhabit that requires getting your feet wet, getting your hands dirty, and spending time learning the language, the non-semantic semiotics, the non-semantic language of nature. And so there's a strong rate limiter on our success if we don't understand how to be extensions of nature. And that looks like, for example, being in relationship to indigenous peoples who still carry those lines. Also, there's still people in the domains of ecology and biology who have kind of models that are useful, but you also really want to smell the flowers and be out there.
Great. That feels like a poignant note to end on. Maybe we should make sure to go and smell some flowers today. But yeah, I just ask everyone to take a moment to just like thank Chris for being here. It was a wonderful discussion. So many interesting things and things that I'll be chewing on for some time to come. But yeah, let's just give him a little virtual round of applause and thank you for being here with us, taking the time.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the invitation, and yeah, I love the work that y'all are doing.
Of course, yeah, we might have to do this again sometime if you're
Maybe
up for
so.
it. Yeah.
There's a lot
All right.
more.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in today. Great discussion. And we'll look forward to seeing you again for future integral altruism sort of speaker and discussion events.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks so much, guys. Have a good one.